Today, we're going to talk about something that I kind of fell over. I was looking at subjects to do for talks, and I looked at Kendall, and there was the Norway Road, and I passed it coming back from Rochester, and I thought, well, I don't really know too much about that. So I looked it up and found out that the very first Norwegian settlement in the United States was in our Kendall. And it was 1825. Ta-da! 200 years ago. So I thought, well, I've got to investigate this. And started looking into the history of why they settled in Kendall. I mean, what was the draw and who was the person that got them to settle in Kendall? The very first Norwegian settlement in the United States. Later on, yes, in the West, Wisconsin and Minnesota and Illinois, there were a lot of Norwegian settlements out there. But we had the very first, which kind of blew my mind, so I had to investigate it. And the man who selected this area, his name was Cleng Pearson. He was considered the father of Norwegian immigration to the United States. There was a monument unveiled to him in 1886 in Norse, Texas. It was a monument dedicated to him, the father of Norwegian immigration to America. It had the following inscription in Norwegian and English: Cleng Pearson, the pioneer of Norse immigration to America. Born in Norway, Europe, May 17, 1782, landed in America in 1821. Died in Texas, December 16, 1865. Grateful countrymen in Texas erected this to his memory. So the man who settled our original settlement in Kendall moved on to Texas and became a very well-known founder of immigration in Texas from Norway. And yet we were the beginning in 1825. Between 1821 and 1824, Pearson built up a strong relationship with Quaker groups in New York State, especially the Quakers in Farmington, in western New York. Farmington was located about 25 miles southeast of Rochester. The Farmington Quakers were the pioneers of all Quakerism in western New York. And also, they were the first white men to bring their families into the vast forests of New York, west of Seneca Lake, for the purpose of transforming Seneca's wilderness hunting ground into a white man's homeland. Some groups of Quakers had also settled in nearby Macedon and Palmyra, 3 miles east of Macedon. The Quakers whom Pearson lived among played an active role in the economic boom connected with the building of the Erie Canal. So the canal was a draw. The settlement near the canal, near Rochester, was a draw. And Kendall became famous. Pearson returned to Norway in the summer of 1824. He presented a positive report to his sponsors on the prospects of emigration, and especially to western New York, and they in turn responded favorably. During his visit, they decided to emigrate the following year. When Pearson returned to New York, the sponsors asked him to locate and buy land on their behalf in the western part of the state and supplied him with capital thought necessary to accomplish this task. So they gave him money to come here to western New York and buy property so they could resell it to Norwegian immigrants. Pearson's letter of December 1824 is crucial for our understanding of what happened in western New York before the first group of Norwegian immigrants left Norway in the summer of 1825. The decisions Pearson took on their behalf before their arrival defined the subsequent paths for action afterwards. The land Pearson had acquired was only a short distance away from the Erie Canal. The Norwegians chose to settle on homesteads in the most dynamic economic region of the United States at the time. This region was also a hothouse for religious revivals and new religious sects. So that area of Kendall, near the canal, was considered a hotbed, a place where you could practice a religion, a place where you could build a new home, a place where foreigners were welcome. And that grew Kendall. Clang Pearson was born in Norway in 1783, and he changed his name to Clang Pearson and became known as the father of Norwegian immigration. His real name was Klein Peterson Hesthammer, and he changed his name to Clang Pearson. He was a Quaker. He forayed to the New World to scout it out as a refuge for religious intolerance. It's reported in the book on the sloopers, is what the Norwegians were called, because they came over here on a boat referred to as a sloop. So they were the sloopers that settled in Kendall. It was decided that a group should travel, and Clang went back to America to prepare for their arrival. Only a small number of the sloopers were members of the Quaker community, but most of them were probably sympathizers with the Quakers. Some of them later on became Quakers. Like the Pilgrim Fathers from England in the 16th century, the passengers on board the Restauration, which was the name of the sloop, left their country because of religious oppression. It was Clang Pearson who encouraged the small group of Quakers to make the 98-day-long voyage across the Atlantic to the New World. In 100 years that followed the voyage of the Restoration, some 80,000 Norwegians emigrated to the New World after that initial group that came here. Today, there are more people of Norwegian descent in the U.S. than the population of Norway, which is currently over 4 million. So we have more than the original homeland do. Only Ireland, with its tiny population of 3 million, contributed more immigrants than Norway. The sloopers, when they landed in New York, October 9th, 1825, they moved to northern New York State and settled in Kendall Township on land Clang Pearson had bought. The settlement became a stopover on the way to the Middle West, where most of the sloopers established a colony on the Fox River Valley in Illinois on Sunday, nearest to October 9th. So they moved on from here to the Midwest. But the Norwegian settlement in Kendall was here about 10 years. They came in 1825 and were still there just into 1835. And then they moved west, and only 2 or 3 families stayed here. The voyage of the boat, the Restoration, left the harbor in Norway with 45 passengers and 7 crew. After a long and difficult journey, the group arrived in New York on October 9th, sometimes dubbed the Norwegian Mayflower, which is appropriate. The Restoration has become a symbol of the first organized migration from Norway to North America. So we had the first settled Norwegians in the United States, in Kendall. The group arrived in New York more than 3 months and 6,000 miles later. So that was a long trip. The first vessel reported, like I said, was called the Restoration, and its 53 passengers and crew arrived in New York Harbor October 9th, 1825. The destination of the party was Orleans County. After an interval of 11 years, more shiploads came, and thereafter the scream from Norway to America's shore was constant. So we were the kickoff. When they first came here, they settled in Kendall, but the reports must have been wonderful, because the reports went back home and they sent more people. More people wanted to come to the United States. A quote from the New York City newspaper reporting on the day the immigrants arrived at the dock said, "A vessel has arrived at this port with immigrants from Norway. The appearance of such a party of strangers coming from so distant a country and in a vessel of a size apparently ill-calculated for a voyage across the Atlantic could not but excite an unusual degree of interest. They have had a voyage of 14 weeks and are all in good health and spirits. An enterprise like this argues a good deal of boldness in the master of the vessel, as well as an adventurous spirit in the passengers, most of whom belong to families from the vicinity of a little town in the southwestern extremity of Norway, near Cape Stavanger. Those who came from the farms are dressed in coarse clothes of domestic manufacture, of a fashion different from the Americans. But those who inhabited the town wear calico, ginghams, and gay shawls, imported, we presume, from England. The vessel is built on the model common to fishing boats on that coast, with a single mast and topsail, sloop rigged. She passed through the English Channel and as far south as Madeira, where she stopped 3 or 4 days and started directly for New York, where she arrived with the addition of 1 passenger born on the way. So one of the mothers had a child on the way. There is a group called the Norwegian Sloopers, which is a Today organization that talks about the sloopers' immigration and tells stories from families of people who immigrated here. It talks about the ship that they came over here on. The sloop was brought into the harbor of Stavanger on May 9th, 1825, where it had to be remodeled to accommodate 52 people. It was so small that they had to remodel it to fit everybody in. Berths had to be built for all of them on the lower deck, but there were only 250 square feet available for sleeping. Even with double bunks, this was less than 2/3 the room needed for 2.5 by 6 foot bunks for the immigrants. These bunks were built in tiers of 3 or 4, and poor passengers had to worm their way in and out like eels. The children probably shared bunks toe to toe. Also, space had to be provided for the chests containing their possessions and provisions. Each family was allowed 1 chest, which was about 2 feet wide, 2 feet high, and 5 feet long. Everything else had to be sold, often a heartbreaking problem. Possessions that had been in the family for generations had to be put up for sale or given away. As for the living and eating space, it was only about 6 inches above their heads up on the deck, where there was a gallery for cooking food and tanks for fresh water, enough to last 52 people for 2 months. There were also lockers to hold fuel for the stove, extra canvas for sails, ropes, and other sailing gear. Every family brought food that would keep cheese, flatbread, rye bread, cookies, dried beef, salt, pork, smoked and dried fish, and dried fruit. For drink, some brought kegs of home-brewed ale, sour milk, tea, and some coffee, which was not common throughout Norway then, although it was used in coastal districts. In the hold, they carried 3.2 tons of Swedish iron for ballast and profit. expecting to sell it upon their arrival. Swedish iron was well known for its excellent quality and had a wide market. In order to comply with the navigation laws and proper clearance papers, it was necessary to select and register a crew. The captain was Lars Helen, and the mate was Peter Eriksson Mellon. 5 of the immigrants agreed to make up the balance of the crew, ranging in age from 15 to 25. And so, on July 4th, 1825, the sloop was officially cleared for sailing with 45 passengers and 7 crew. As they sailed out of the harbor at Stavanger, displaying the new flag, many people waved, and the battery at Kalhammer fired a salute. A great-granddaughter of one of the sloopers many years later wrote the following poem. What courage it must have taken to leave each familiar face and sail over the trackless ocean and live in a strange new place. But the new world called and beckoned. It seemed they had to go, and courage was given as needed for that journey so long and slow. Gives you an idea of the conditions that they traveled in under to get to this new world. Due to their sudden departure on jump ahead of the law of England, the sloopers were nearly out of food and water when they arrived halfway here. A cask was spotted floating on the waves, and they lost no time in lowering a yawl to get it, to see it contained. One slooper almost lost his hand when attacked by a shark while he was attempting to tie a rope around the middle of the cask. Out of the water, the cask was found to be completely covered by barnacles, indicating that it had been in sea for quite a long time. Upon opening it, they found it contained a very delicious wine, which most of the crew and some of the passengers immediately indulged in. By the time the ship drifted into the harbor, it was without colors and apparently without command. The harbor patrol feared the sloop was a plague ship, with a crew dead or dying, and that a disease was being brought into the city. A German ship was anchored nearby, and having seen that the cannon of the harbor fortress was already aimed at the strange vessel, they called across the water, "Hoist flag, hoist flag!" This alerted the sloopers to their danger, and they quickly searched for a Norwegian flag, which they had been stowed somewhere under their baggage. One of the women passengers stood up on the prow and, disregarding the immodest display of her legs, waved her bright calico skirt to prevent the cannon from being fired. Another passenger finally found the flag and with the help ran it out of the top of the mast. The Portuguese customs officers came on board and found things in good order. So thank goodness for the lady waving her skirt. It wasn't a flag, but it worked. The sloopers arrived in Madeira on August 1st. They were about 2,070 sea miles out from Stavanger and had spent 27 days on the water, an average of 77 miles a day. Long, long trip to get to America. It was probable that religious meetings were held on board when the weather permitted. This woman writing this, my great-great-grandfather, who was 28 at the time, was presumed to be one of the leaders because of his later religious work. So those kinds of comments are made by people whose relatives came over here on that ship. The most important personal event of the voyage was the birth of a baby girl on September 2nd, when the sloop was near the West Indies. Finally, on Sunday, October 9th, 1825, 64 days after leaving Madeira and 98 days out of Norway, the sloopers entered New York Harbor. But they were not out of trouble. There had been a law passed in 1819 that they knew nothing about, stating that all ships entering the country must carry no more than 2 passengers for every 5 tons of the ship's weight. The fine for excess passengers was $150 each. The Restauration weighed less than 30 tons and should have carried not more than 16 passengers. They were a little over. The customs officials were sympathetic, though, and reckoned the ship's weight to be 60 tons, which would accommodate 24 passengers. This still left 21 passengers to pay a fine of $3,150, which they did not have. The crew was not considered passengers. The passengers had gone ahead, traveling by steamboat, something very new then, up the Hudson River, Erie Canal, across New York to Buffalo. They were on the Erie Canal when it officially opened, October 26, 1825. Departing the canal west of Rochester, they traveled north through the woods about 9 miles to the shore of Lake Ontario. This was their first settlement in the Kendall colony, or Murray as it was called. My great-great-grandfather traveled from there to Niagara Falls, where he met and married Sarah Porter Chamberlain, a cousin of the wife of Daniel Webster. Their first child, Bertha Ann, who was my great-grandmother, was born there. So you can see there's lots of interesting little tidbits that come from reading anything written down by the people who sailed here or by family of those people. And in all this, believe it or not, 100 years later, in 1925, Calvin Coolidge gave a speech about the Norwegians' celebration at the Minnesota State Fair, and he included the first Norwegians. So Calvin Coolidge, 30th President of the United States, gave this speech, and I thought it'd be interesting to read it to you. It's not terribly long, but I thought it was kind of cool that the President of the United States made a comment. Almost without money or supplies, a little company of immigrants were taken in charge by the New York Quakers, who raised funds to send them to Kendall, Orleans County, New York. There they secured lands and established the first Norwegian settlement in this country. It is a curious circumstance that although the Norwegians are among the greatest seafaring people in this party was composed almost entirely of farmers, so that their first interest was to get land. And ever since, the greater share of Norwegians have come in search of homes on the land. These first immigrants, having practically no money, bought a tract on the shore of Lake Ontario for $5 per acre to be paid for in 10 annual installments. It's hard to realize that Western New York, so late as 1825, was so far on the frontier. Their land was heavily timbered, and they were compelled not only to clear it, but to build their own shelter. The first house is said to have been a log cabin 12 feet square with a garret. In this, 21 of them lived for a time, the men seeking such scanty employment as was to be found in the neighborhood to support them through the winter. The only one in the party who could speak English was Captain Lars Olson, and he had remained in New York. So we had Norwegians here who could not speak English that were trying to survive in the wilderness in a new land. More power to them. Despite poverty and hardships, the colony thrived, and its members were shortly writing letters back to Norway, describing the opportunities of America and urging friends to come. From this beginning, the stream of Norwegian immigration set in, but most of the latter comers went farther west. A few years after the settlement at Kendall, another party went to LaSalle County, Illinois. Already, the West was fascinating them. Many of the original Kendall colonies sold out and went on to Illinois. Thence the migration spread on to other states of the Middle West and Northwest. Even before it was formed into a territory, Iowa had received its first Norwegians, and from about 1835 they spread rapidly into Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and other states. It's not impossible, as it is certainly not needful on this occasion, even to summarize the story of Norwegian immigration. But it should be explained that while the settlement of 1825 in Orleans County, New York, was the first Norwegian settlement and represented the first organized immigration, these pioneers of the Restoration were not the first Norwegians to come here. Considerable numbers had come even before the Revolutionary War, and some as far back as the earliest colonial years. There were Norwegians in both Army and Navy during the Revolution and the War of 1812. But the fact remains that the great movement which established Norwegian communities all over the Northwest and contributed so greatly to the building in that part of the country began with the voyage of the Restoration. It's said that Norwegians and their descendants in this country are now just about as numerous as the population of Norway itself. Norway is credited with furnishing the large number of settlers in the United States in proportion to its population than any other European country. That was Calvin Coolidge. And I think that's quite a bit of status to have a president talking about the Norwegian settlement in our county. I think probably in doing this research, well, I called Catherine Cooper, the county historian, and said, you know, do you realize it's been 200 years since the Kendall Norwegian settlement? And she said, yeah, I did. And I called the Kendalltown historian. And she said, yeah, she said, you know, Dee, in fact, I've been contacted by Norway. They want to know if they are sending over a copy of the Restoration, the ship that brought the Norwegians here. They've made a duplicate of it and is sending it across the ocean again this year to dock in New York. And they asked if it would be possible if she could give them a tour of Kendall. And she said, I laughed and I said, yeah, I could show you the marker. Because none of the settlement, unquote, is still there. Apparently one house has a basement that was part of a building that was built there by the Norwegians. But the colony only lasted 10 years. And they really didn't build like stone buildings or brick buildings. They were wooden buildings and didn't last. But I think it's quite something that they are planning on coming over here from Norway again this year. And they are talking about sending some of their tourists to Kendall to see where the first Norwegian settlement was. I think that's quite something. So I think we all ought to have our antennas out. If we hear that there is a group coming to Kendall.
Will it be in October? Because that's when they...
I would guess that. I haven't heard anything definite, but let's see, the Restoration, the 200th voyage, is to follow the original route and experiences who sailed in 1825. So they would be going in the similar direction, trying to go that way.
They're gonna cram 50 people on it?
I don't know. That might be an interesting question. To preserve the 1825 voyage history and bring its stories into our 2025 interpretation. So they're saying, let's do this as it really was done, not the way we think it was done. So they're going to research letters and so on. To celebrate the strong ties between Norway, the United States, and Canada, to remember what it means to take risks and trade one home for another, to better understand the migration of peoples that continue worldwide today, to raise awareness of emigration from Norway and shed new light on the history of Norwegian immigration, to discuss contemporary migration issues in the light of our own history, and to build closer ties between today's Norwegians abroad and Norway. And this is Crossing 2025. It is a PR brochure on this new trip of the Restoration. And so I really was flabbergasted when I tripped over this, that I was looking for, but here they're going to recreate that trip coming to the United States, and wanted to know if they could have a tour of Kendall. I think that's quite something. And so I wanted to let you know about it. I think it's interesting. I think it's something we should look forward to, and do a lot of PR, so I've got something else to talk about.
What has Kendall got planned for this?
I don't know. I mean, the historian, I think her name is Lydia, when I talked to her, she said, I just got the contact. And she's a fairly new historian, so she kind of got this dumped on her head. But I think with everybody knowing about it, and if they're going to be sending representatives, I think we all ought to back her and do what we can to help her. Welcome these people. Because we had the first Norwegian settlement in the United States.
You said that there was still like a foundation. Is it on Norway Road?
I'd have to look again, but it's in a house that still exists from what I understand. And the house was like expanded and built, but part of the basement.
Is there a marker there, do you know?
Pardon me?
A marker there, or is it?
There's a marker for the Kendall settlement, yes. But I don't know about that particular building. I'm sure the marker is somewhere near the building. But whether it is in front of the building or up the road, I don't know. I didn't get that far. Yeah.
In Rochester, there's a group called the Sons of Norway. The group's all over the country, but maybe they might have more information.
They might.
Might be more given to them than to somebody at Kendall.
Well, but I think too, in that Kendall was the first Norwegian settlement. There might be a spotlight on it.
Yeah.
And maybe they do have letters that were, telling about that Kendall settlement, and my great aunt Aggie lived there for a time with her husband, that sort of thing. Which to me is interesting if you can find letters by people written about that particular time.
There's one of those state signs at the corner of the county line and Sand Road, which is just south of Morton. I don't know, and I live there. My house is right down the street, so I'm going to take a look. That might be the marker.
There's supposed to be a couple markers in Kendall.
But I know that marker identifies that area as being an original settlement of something, but
probably.
I don't know exactly who it's referencing, but I'll look.
Yeah. Well, now you have an assignment. Yeah.
So, Dee, when we were here, I think it was maybe 3 months ago, we were talking about the ship, I think it was a sloop, maybe it wasn't, that came over and everyone came up the Erie Canal with the guy who was the captain, I think.
Yeah, he stayed with the ship, yeah.
And he ice skated up.
Yes.
Now, how does that fit in with what
that was the man who was in charge of the ship that the Norwegians came over on. They got off the ship and got onto a boat that sailed up the Erie Canal. He was in charge of selling the ship. And by the time he got the ship sold, the canal had shut down and it was turning to winter. And so the only thing left was ice in the bottom of the canal. And so he had to skate the length of the canal to get to Kendall. So he got his exercise.
That wasn't the first sloop.
That was the first Norwegian settlement. There were a few Norwegians, like it said, that settled in Wisconsin or Illinois or other places, but not a whole group that came on a ship and settled in one area.
But is the one where the guy skated? I'll never forget that. That's really.
It's hard to imagine somebody skating down the canal.
Well, actually, Bill Lattin's father did.
Well-
He went from where to where?
Well, from, just west of Elgin to Rochester.
Are we surprised? No.
So what I'm asking is that one that we're talking about where he skated up, was that the first boat to come?
They left the sloop in New York.
Right, but is that the first group?
Yeah, that is the first large group of Norwegians who came, and they came up the canal and settled in
Right.
Kendall.
And then
That
he
was
came
the
later.
biggest group. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he stayed in New York to sell the ship. But to try and sell the ship, it took him time, and by the time he was done, the canal had been drained. And he had to get from New York to Kendall. And there wasn't a bus or anything, you know, so.
Yeah, or a train.
Yeah.
That's that, right? That's surprising that the canal was drained at that time.
Yeah, but they did, because I think too, you would have had, in my way of thinking, the winters were worse than they are now. And if you had that quantity of water freezing, it would have worked on the edges of the canal and would have caused you more problems to start the next season with. So they drained it to prevent that icing and breaking of the sides of the canal. I think that's my opinion now. I could be wrong.
That could have been an engineer involved in this that perhaps suggested to him this.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have kind of an ADD brain, but I got to thinking, undiagnosed. I got to thinking when you said about the baby being born, where's the birth right to when they're in the water coming over? I suppose if you're in international waters would be the big question.
I don't think it was that big a question at that
Okay,
point.
so
She had the baby survived, she survived Rebecca.
yeah, okay,
You know,
and
and I
probably
think
it was the guy.
They're not worried about
Yeah.
where. It was born on the ship.
Yeah,
It belongs to her.
yeah, so,
So wherever she deems, that's where the child was
Yeah.
born. Yeah.
Did any of them stay? You said about 10 years they had.
They had a couple families that stayed, but the vast majority of them traveled west.
That are buried up at Mount Albion, but I don't know.
There are a couple families that did stay, that were the original Norwegian group.
And there's a Norway Road.
Yes, and there's a Norway Road, and that's what I saw, thinking, why is there a Norway Road in Kendall? You know, which fed it, and I kept looking and kept researching. And I didn't grow up around here, so I didn't understand that there was a Norwegian community.
Does the Norway Road go all the way to the lake?
Norway goes clear, it goes clear to the lake, yeah,
Okay.
from the ridge
The
down.
north-south road that's parallel to, like the county line, and it's one road to the west.
Mhm.
And it goes to the lake, goes under the parkway.
Yeah.
Goes up to 18. It actually goes all the way down there.
Goes away to the beach, doesn't it? Goes up,
Yeah.
well, within a matter of feet.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, thank you for coming.
thank you.
Thanks for listening. Now you have all